Joshua led the Israelites into the Promised Land and through a military conquest of the land. God promised Abraham about 600 years earlier that his descendants would inherit the land of the Canaanites. However, he was told that this would not take place for hundreds of years because the sin of the inhabitants had not yet reached its full measure. Through archaeology and biblical evidence, we know that the Canaanites were depraved through perverse sexual sins, idol worship, and child sacrifice. God used the Israelites to exercise his divine judgment on the people of Canaan while simultaneously blessing Israel with their land. Some question why God would have the Israelites perform the dirty work of exercising judgment on the Canaanites. Surely this would have resulted in greater Israelite casualties as well as PTSD among the soldiers involved. Why didn't God destroy the cities with fire from heaven as he did with Sodom and Gomorrah? The most likely answer is so that the Israelites witnessed how seriously God deals with sin and how depraved the Canaanites truly were. This served as a warning to Israel of the consequences that would come if they did not obey God's commands in the law or if they adopted any of the practices of the Canaanites. If God had simply destroyed the cities, as he did with Sodom and Gomorrah, the Israelites would make excuses when they failed to live up to God's standards for them by saying they did not understand the importance of following God's commands. They would never have seen the consequences of Canaan's actions firsthand. It is worth noting that despite this, eventually Israel would still adopt many of the practices of the Canaanites and worship their gods. The Israelites would even sacrifice their children to the gods of the Canaanites. Because of their conquest of the Canaanites, they were without excuse for their actions, and God was completely justified in punishing them. After Moses' death, God commissioned Joshua to enter the Promised Land and drive the Canaanites out. God also instructed him to obey the law and be strong and courageous, for God was with him. Joshua sent spies into the land of Canaan where they were helped by a prostitute named Rahab, who hid the spies from the king of Jericho. The spies returned to Israel and reported, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us." Joshua and the Israelites marched into the Promised Land and began their conquest of the city of Jericho, which was surrounded by strong walls. God instructed the Israelites to march around the city for 7 days, and on the 7th day, they were to shout and blast their trumpets. God promised the walls around the city would come crumbling down, and the Israelites would be able to take the city. The Israelites conquered Jericho through God's deliverance alone, and they allowed Rahab and her family to join their community. The next account shows how one man, named Achan, caused the Israelites to be defeated due to his sin. After the Israelites dealt with him, God granted them victory once again. These accounts show how Israel was dependent on God to conquer their enemies, and they were not exempt from God's high moral standards. On the contrary, as God's chosen people, they were held to an even higher standard. The Israelites continued to conquer the Canaanites and drive them out of the land. Finally, Joshua was able to divide the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. When Joshua grew old, he addressed the Israelites and warned them to remain set apart from the nations around them, and to be a holy nation that honors and obeys God. He told them that if they did not heed his warning, they would suffer a similar fate as the Canaanites they just conquered. This era presents many theological principles throughout it. Once again, God is seen as being faithful to his promises to Abraham. God promised Abraham that his descendants would inherit this land once the judgment against the Canaanites was due. We also see that God is all-powerful and is sovereign over all world affairs, even the affairs of nations. God defeated the Canaanites and merely used the Israelites as his instrument for this. The events of this book were completely orchestrated by God and fit into his overarching plan for Israel and humanity. Finally, God's holiness is on display in this era. God cannot tolerate the sins of the Canaanites, so he sends the Israelites to destroy them. Just as he destroyed sinful people with the flood, he destroyed sinful people again with Israel. He was not picking favorites though, because even when Israelites sinned, God punished them as well, as we saw with the account of Achan. God cannot tolerate sin and must punish it. Although it is not as obvious as some other eras, the conquest of the Canaanites points to Jesus as well. First, the prostitute Rahab points to Jesus in an interesting way, since she is actually listed in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew's Gospel. As a matter of fact, she is mentioned in the New Testament more often than Joshua is, and her faith is usually what is being highlighted. She was saved through faith, not through her works, and as a result she became part of the family of Christ in a literal way. Her story shows that anyone can be saved by putting their trust in God. We can also see Jesus in how Israel received the Promised Land. Just as Joshua ushered the Israelites into the Promised Land, Jesus is ushering humanity into a new heaven and new earth. The earthly conquest of the Promised Land points to a spiritual conquest against sin, and the arrival into the Promised Land points to the arrival of the new heaven and the new earth. Another way this era points to Jesus is through the conquest of the Promised Land. Just as Joshua and the Israelites fought the evil and sin of the Canaanites, Jesus fought the evil and sin of all humanity through the cross. The contrast is found in how they fought sin. Joshua fought sin by slaying sinners, while Jesus fought sin by being slain for sinners.